In 1804, a man named John Bell realized his farm in North Carolina was becoming too small for his ever-growing family. He decided to move, taking his wife Lucy and their 6 children, and traveled over 966 miles west in search of more land. After a long and arduous journey, they arrived at a 1,000-acre plot along the Red River in northern Tennessee, an area that would later become Robertson County. At the time, it was a sparsely populated rural area. Once the Bell family arrived in the county, they began working with the few families already living there to build a new settlement, a town from scratch. John Bell, who had grown up on a farm, was accustomed to hard work and never gave up. He was generous, kind, and well-liked. In North Carolina, he opened his home to any traveler in need, and anyone who came to his house hungry was always given food. His neighbors knew he was never stingy with money or assistance. When they moved to Robertson, John agreed with his neighbors to establish the settlement. He began by clearing trees from his land, collecting the timber, and building a 2-story wooden house near the Red River. The river was a popular spot for the few residents of the area to fish and picnic, and John quickly became acquainted with many of his neighbors, forming strong friendships with them. Over time, the Bell family became one of the most well-known in the area. John's younger children went to school, while his older sons helped him build houses and gradually transform the land into a real town. He and his sons also began building wooden boats to transport tobacco and meat across the river, supporting their growing agricultural business. During their years there, Lucy gave birth to 3 more children, while the older sons married and built houses near their fathers. But one summer day in 1817, 13 years after their arrival in the county, something strange happened, something that would turn their lives into a nightmare. John was walking through a cornfield near his house when he spotted a huge dog sitting on the ground among the stalks. But it wasn't an ordinary dog. It looked deformed, as if its bones had broken and then fused together incorrectly, and its body was so large it looked more like a wolf than a dog. Even stranger, the animal was looking directly at John without blinking or turning around. John, despite his bravery, felt a strange unease. He raised his rifle and fired. The animal suddenly leaped up and disappeared behind the trees without showing any sign of injury. John approached the spot where the dog had been sitting, expecting to see the stalks crushed under its weight or paw prints around it. But to his surprise, the ground was completely unchanged. No trace, no footprint, no sign of any animal. John went back to his house, trying to ignore what had happened, thinking it was probably just a stray dog. But that night, as the family was getting ready for bed, there was a loud banging on the door. Everyone jumped up in fright, and the banging stopped. As soon as they went back to bed, the banging started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from all around the house, as if someone was circling it and deliberately banging on the walls. John was sure it wasn't the sound of an animal. It was a human trying to disturb them. But every time they went out to check, they found no one. And this terror continued for weeks on end. The sounds continued every night. Each time, John would stand behind the door or hide behind a window, waiting for the knocking to resume. As soon as he heard the sound, he would quickly open the door, but he found no one. No footprints, not a single sign that a stranger had approached the house. Although those sounds were disturbing, what happened next was far more terrifying. One night, 4 of John's sons were asleep in their room. They awoke to a sound like a mouse gnawing under the wooden bunk bed. The older sons, who were sleeping in the lower bunk, jumped up at the sound to catch the mouse, but as soon as their feet touched the floor, the sound vanished completely. They searched the room, looked under the bed, and examined the bed legs, which they thought the mouse had been gnawing, but they found them undamaged, without a single scratch. They went back to bed, and as soon as they closed their eyes, the sound started again. But this time, it wasn't the sound of a mouse. It was a violent noise, like someone using a saw to cut wood from under the bed. And as usual, as soon as they got out of bed, the sound disappeared completely. This went on all night, and they couldn't sleep. The next night, the same thing happened again, with the same terror and the same sounds. On the third night, a new sound appeared, a groaning sound coming from under the bed. It was as if someone was choking, dying, and struggling to breathe. Then there were loud bangs coming from under the bed, as if the person choking was hitting the wooden planks with their hands, trying to escape. The children were terrified, but they mustered their courage and jumped up to see what was under the bed. And, as always, as soon as their feet touched the floor, all the sounds vanished at once. But the terror had left its mark. The children couldn't sleep in their room anymore. They woke the rest of the family, and they all started searching the house in the middle of the night, looking for any clue. But they found nothing. No footprints, no open windows, nothing had moved. The whole house was exactly as they had left it. Up until that point, the family hadn't spoken to anyone about what was happening. John had forbidden them from doing so, believing that whoever was causing the disturbance would eventually be found and arrested, and because he didn't want them to look foolish or crazy in front of others. But as the situation worsened and no one could sleep, John realized that it was too much for them to handle alone. So he went to his nearest neighbor and told him everything. John was known in the area as a straightforward man who didn't make up stories or joke about such matters. The neighbor said to him, "I'll stay with you tonight and see for myself." And indeed, that night, the neighbor slept at John's house and heard everything himself. Knocks on the walls, the sounds of wood being gnawed, and the sound of someone choking under the bed. Fear gripped him so completely that he couldn't stay until morning, so he fled the house and returned home. The news spread throughout Robertson County. The residents reacted with sympathy, knowing that the Bell family were among the most respected in the area, that they had played a significant role in building the settlement, and that they were known for their generosity and kindness. So the people decided to help them. Some residents volunteered to stay overnight at the house, hoping that a larger group of people would deter the perpetrator or reveal the source of the mysterious noises. But despite the men gathering at the house for several nights, the noises remained the same, unchanged. And people began to offer their own explanations. Some said that John's young daughter was playing pranks. Others believed that someone who deeply disliked the Bell family was targeting them in this way. Others speculated that the perpetrator might be using a talent or technique called ventriloquism, where some people can produce sounds without moving their lips. But the truth was far more terrifying than any of them could have imagined. There are people who possess a strange ability to speak and make sounds without moving their lips, as if the sound were coming from somewhere far away, not from their mouths. Just like those who manipulate puppets and speak from their ventriloquists. And that's where the idea came from. The family believed that the person making the strange sounds might be one of them, living among them and deceiving them with those voices. To be sure, some villagers volunteered to spend the night at John's house. Each volunteer watched a member of the family while they slept. In other words, every member of John's family slept while another person watched them throughout the night, just to find out who was making those sounds. And indeed, the sounds appeared as before, but no one could identify their source. They were absolutely certain that no one in John's family was making those sounds. The family resigned themselves to the situation and decided to live with this terrifying phenomenon, for there was no solution. 6 months passed, and people began to notice something frightening about John himself. John was known for his sharp mind, listening intently to every word spoken to him. But suddenly, people began to see him talking to something that wasn't there. His eyes would widen terrifyingly, and his lower jaw would droop violently. At first, it was a mild episode. Then it progressed until his jaw began to twitch violently. John would be sitting with anyone and then suddenly have that attack. After he came to, he would fall silent, get up without a word, and go home. He would lie in bed for hours, neither eating nor drinking, staring at a fixed point on the wall, as if something were calling to him from there. As for John's family, they began to live like prisoners in their own home. They felt that someone had stolen their peace, that someone was playing on their nerves within that cursed house. During that time, people in the town began to suspect a woman named Kate Batts, John's neighbor. An eccentric, unlucky woman. Her husband had become disabled and her 3 children had died young. She spoke very quickly and in a complex way that no one understood. Some people thought she wasn't normal or that something was controlling her. When she heard that people believed she was the source of the voices, she was deeply insulted and said she had absolutely nothing to do with what was happening in John's house. By September 1920, the terrifying events in John's house had continued for 3 full years. The family grew accustomed to the voices, but John's condition worsened day by day. The panic attacks increased, and he spent more and more hours alone in his room, staring at the wall. One night, he even said to his wife Lucy, "I feel like someone is being tortured here. Someone is dying slowly." One day, John's eldest daughter, Esther, went to the chicken coop to collect eggs. As soon as she stepped outside, she heard footsteps approaching. She turned around and saw a woman dressed entirely in black. She was walking in the same direction, but towards John's house. Esther was surprised. She hadn't seen the woman when she left the house moments before, but she wasn't too worried. She figured the woman might have come from a side road. She gathered the eggs and went back, but to her surprise, the woman in black was getting closer to their house. That meant she was heading there. Esther tried to hurry and get closer. She could only see the woman from behind. Her head was down, her face hidden. "Hello, can you hear me?" she called out. But the woman didn't answer. She didn't raise her head. She didn't even change her pace. She continued walking slowly toward the house, as if Esther wasn't there. Esther quickened her pace. She called out louder. She got so close that there were only 5 meters between her and the woman. But the woman kept walking without responding, as if she couldn't hear anything. Esther looked around. There was no one else on the road besides her and the woman. She felt something strange, something pressing on her chest, a sense of danger. She stopped in her tracks, and at that very moment, the woman in black stopped. She stood still, without turning around, without moving her head. The strange woman stood with her back to Esther, then slowly raised her hands to her head. She grasped her black hood, tore it off, and threw it to the ground. The moment the hood fell, her long hair cascaded down her back. Then the woman began to brush her hair with her fingers. At first, she moved slowly, as if brushing her hair normally. But Esther, who was cautiously approaching, noticed something shocking. The closer Esther got, the faster the woman moved, inhumanly. She moved her fingers with a speed no human could possibly achieve, a terrifying, jerky, unnatural movement. When Esther was close enough, she discovered the truth. The woman wasn't brushing her hair. She was ripping strands of it out by the roots and throwing them to the ground. Esther could clearly hear the sound of hair being ripped from her scalp, and in a few moments, the ground around the woman was covered in a complete circle of torn hair. Esther trembled with terror. She ran as fast as she could, past the woman without looking at her face, and rushed into the house. She slammed the door shut behind her and shouted for her sister to come quickly. The two sisters stood at the front window, staring at the horrifying scene. The woman was still there, tearing at her hair frantically, with strands of hair littering the floor around her. Suddenly, Esther's eyes met the woman's. At that precise moment, the woman stopped moving completely. Her fingers clutching her hair froze, and she froze Esther with an indescribable stare. Esther and her sister backed away in fear as the woman slowly lowered her hands. Then she turned sideways and began walking away until she disappeared from sight. The sisters ran to a side window to see where she had gone. John's house was surrounded by a low wooden fence. They saw the woman climbing the wall, but the terrifying thing was that she wasn't alone. Behind her were 3 children who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Esther and her sister had never seen them before, and they couldn't understand where they came from. The woman and the children climbed the trees surrounding the house, and as soon as they reached the top, they all turned their faces toward the window, toward Esther and her sister, and began swinging their bodies violently from side to side. The trees were moving violently, as if a storm were raging through them, even though the air was completely still. At that moment, Esther's husband came in through the front door. Esther shouted for him to quickly look at the trees. But when he looked, he didn't see the woman or the children. All he saw were trees moving as if the wind were pushing them. That's when Esther and her sister realized that what they were seeing was something no one else could see. They rushed out into the trees, searching for any trace, but the woman and children had vanished completely. No footprints, not a single sign of their presence. Shortly after this incident, in October 1820, John Bell was walking on the farm with one of his sons. Suddenly, he stopped in his tracks, raising his hands to protect his face, as if someone were attacking him. Then his face changed. It became eerily calm, and his body began to contort. His bones creaked, his back arched backward as if it would break in two. His son froze, unsure what to do. He tried to lift his father, and as soon as he caught him, a tremendous scream echoed through the air. A terrifying scream, unlike any human voice. It came from nowhere, then vanished just as suddenly. Everything ended as it had begun. John sat on the floor weeping and said to his son in a trembling voice, "I don't have much time left in this world." The two returned home in silence. A few weeks later, on the morning of December 19th, 1820, John didn't come down from his room for breakfast. When they went upstairs, they found him lying on the bed, his eyes closed, breathing with difficulty, but he wouldn't wake up. One of his sons rushed to the medicine cabinet, but they were shocked to find that all the medicine was gone. All they found was a small bottle containing a black liquid, unlabeled, unseen. They had never seen it before. No one knew how this bottle had gotten into the house or who had replaced the medicine with it. They called the doctor, but the doctor couldn't diagnose John, and he took the unknown bottle to examine its contents. The doctor took the mysterious bottle to examine the black liquid inside. He told the family that its nature could only be determined by testing it on a small animal. The family went outside, brought a stray cat, and gave it the liquid to drink. Just a few minutes later, the cat collapsed and died instantly. Everyone was shocked. One by one, the family members swore that none of them had put the bottle in the medicine cabinet and that they didn't know where it came from or who had brought it into the house. As for John, he never woke up that day. The next morning, they found him dead. After John's death, the strange occurrences in the house decreased significantly, but the townspeople said they saw lights appear and disappear around John's house, and on some nights they heard singing coming from there. John's wife remained in the house until 1838. Today, nothing remains of John's house, but the farm that surrounded it still exists, and beneath it lies a large underground cavern. Some residents believe that the cave is the source of the sounds that tormented John and his family, but the full truth behind what happened remains unknown. The only thing that is clear is that whoever was tormenting John, whether human or non-human, wanted to take revenge on him specifically. On the evening of January 23rd, 1897, more than 120 years ago, there lived a blacksmith named Erasmus Shaw in West Virginia. That day, Erasmus was working in his small workshop, lighting the furnace to prepare horseshoes. He had a young assistant, 11 years old, who was busy cleaning the workshop. Erasmus was supposed to close the workshop and go home, but a customer arrived urgently requesting a horseshoe, forcing him to stay and work late. Before starting work, he wanted to check on his wife, Zona, who was pregnant, a fact neither of them had told anyone about for fear of complications. There were no telephones back then, so he asked the boy to go home and tell his wife he would be late and to ask if she needed anything. The boy left immediately, while Erasmus began shaping the hot iron with a hammer. But his mind wasn't on the blacksmith. It was preoccupied with his pregnant wife. Zona was a beautiful girl with long black hair and bright black eyes. She was cheerful and loved to laugh. She had met Erasmus only 2 months earlier, and they had married quickly, despite the objections of her mother, Mary Jane, who was uneasy about the man. He was 12 years older than her daughter, and a stranger who had come to the village without anyone knowing his origins or family. But Zona was stubborn and insisted on marrying him. The couple lived in a small house, and she quickly became pregnant. They were overjoyed by the pregnancy, but its complications made them postpone announcing the news to everyone. At that moment, the boy arrived at the house. The house had 2 floors, and its front door faced the road directly. The boy stood in front of the door and knocked once, twice, 3 times, but no one answered. Every time he came home, he would hear Zona's footsteps or her voice moving inside or talking to the neighbors. But this time, the house was completely silent. The boy tried again, to no avail. Then he carefully grasped the doorknob and gave it a little push. The door opened. The boy noticed that the house was completely dark inside, with no light on, even though it was after sunset. He went inside, calling for Zona, but no one answered. At the first step of the staircase leading to the 2nd floor, he froze in terror. It was there that he saw Zona lying on the floor, on her back, her hands across her chest. He approached her with trembling steps, shouting and trying to wake her, but there was no response. There was no sign of life. Terrified, the boy ran out of the house and into his own home, telling his mother that the blacksmith's wife looked like she was dead. His mother rushed to Erasmus's workshop and told him what had happened. Erasmus hurried home with the doctor who had been monitoring Zona's pregnancy. It took the doctor a full hour to arrive, where he found the boy, his mother, and several neighbors gathered on the ground floor. When the doctor went up to the bedroom, he found Erasmus sitting on the edge of the bed, cradling Zona's head in his hands, stroking her hair as he swayed and wept uncontrollably. The doctor asked Erasmus to move aside so he could examine her. The man lowered his wife's head onto the pillow and sat beside her, weeping as he stroked her hair. After the examination, the doctor confirmed that she had passed away. He suspected she had fallen down the stairs due to pregnancy complications, causing her to faint and suffer internal bleeding that led to her death. The following day, Zona's funeral was held on a hill overlooking the local cemetery. Everyone was deeply saddened, especially when they saw Erasmus, distraught and barely able to breathe, weeping for his wife and unborn child. Before the coffin was closed, he placed her favorite scarf around her neck, and then the coffin was sealed and she was laid to rest. But the only person who showed no grief, whose eyes didn't shed a single tear, was Zona's mother, Mary Jane. She stood stiffly, staring at Erasmus with undisguised hatred and disgust, then abruptly left the funeral without speaking to anyone. In the following days, Mary Jane's behavior gradually became increasingly strange. She stopped receiving visitors and rarely left her house. Neighbors would see her from their windows, lighting numerous candles in her room, then kneeling on the floor and staring at a specific point for hours. When she was forced to go out, she walked absent-mindedly, muttering to herself incomprehensibly and glancing behind her as if someone were chasing her. As for her husband, he spent the nights in the barn, leaving her alone in the house, as if he were afraid to sleep under the same roof as her. On the morning of February 21st, about a month after Zona's death, Mary Jane left her house dressed in clean clothes, a stark contrast to her usual unkempt appearance. She wasn't muttering strange words, nor was she glancing fearfully behind her. She walked with a steady gait, her back straight, like a soldier marching in formation. But the only thing people noticed on her face that day was anger. She continued walking in this manner until she reached the local prosecutor's office. She didn't knock, as everyone else would. She simply opened the door and walked right in. Everyone in the office knew her story, her strange behavior since her daughter's death, so they were shocked to see her enter with such confidence. She immediately asked to speak with the prosecutor, and out of curiosity and surprise, he allowed her into his office. Mary Jane sat down before him and began to recount her extraordinary story, the story of her daughter Zona's death. She spoke for nearly 2 hours while the prosecutor listened, trying to understand what she was saying. At first, he thought she was just a distraught mother driven mad by grief. But as time passed, he began to feel that her words weren't mere fantasies, but held a deeper meaning, perhaps a hidden truth. When she finished speaking, the prosecutor became convinced that what she had said might be true, and if he had to reopen the case. After she left his office, he went directly to the doctor who had examined Zona at the time of her death and asked him to exhume her body. The doctor was shocked, but after hearing the strange story, he agreed to a re-examination. The next day, February 22nd, the prosecutor arrived at Zona's grave with several men. They began digging until they unearthed the coffin, and then one of them carried the body, which was remarkably well preserved due to the extreme cold of the ground at that time of year. The body was taken to a room in a nearby school, where only the doctor and the prosecutor remained. After only 30 seconds of examination, they found what Mary Jane had been talking about. The two men looked at each other in astonishment and disbelief, for her story was absolutely true. And now, here is the chilling story Mary Jane told. On the day of Zona's funeral, though the mother was heartbroken over her daughter's loss, her hatred for Erasmus overwhelmed her. She saw him weeping and wailing in grief, but in her eyes, he was nothing more than a skilled actor playing the role of the heartbroken lover. She felt furious at everyone who sympathized with him, as if she wanted to scream at them, "Don't believe him, he's the cause of all this." She was certain that her daughter's death hadn't been natural, that Erasmus was hiding something. After the funeral, all her anger vanished, replaced by only one feeling. How can I contact my daughter? How can I find out the truth? She went into her room and knelt down. But she wasn't praying for mercy or peace. She was praying that her daughter's ghost would appear and tell her what had happened. And so began a long, obsessive journey that lasted a whole month. Candles burning all night, talking to the void, a frantic search for a sign, a breath of air, a passing shadow, anything to indicate that Zona's spirit had come. Until mid-February arrived. Mary Jane was in her room, as she did every night, kneeling and murmuring, surrounded by candles. And suddenly, a bright light appeared in the center of the room. When the light appeared in the room, the air grew very cold. Mary Jane fixed her gaze on it, hoping it was the ghost of her daughter, Zona. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, and the room returned to its normal temperature. Mary Jane was overjoyed. She felt that her prayers had finally been answered, and that the light might indeed be her daughter's ghost or a sign of her imminent appearance. She continued to pray even more fervently, hoping that Zona's ghost would appear. Over the next 2 days, the light appeared twice more, each time disappearing very quickly, which puzzled Mary Jane, but confirmed her belief that her prayers were being answered. The 4th time, as Mary Jane prayed, surrounded by candles, the bright light appeared again, and the air around her grew cold. At that moment, she saw her daughter. Zona emerged from the light, her body appearing in the center of the room. She was dressed entirely in black, her eyes sunken, her hair flowing over her shoulders, and she stood there, staring at Mary Jane. Although she had been expecting this since the previous month, actually seeing her daughter's ghost terrified her. Her heart began to pound, her back trembled, but the ghost drew closer, forcing her to back away until her back hit the wall. Mary Jane mustered her courage in that moment, realizing this was the moment she had been waiting for. She had to be strong and speak to the ghost to learn the truth about her daughter's death. Her only question was, when and how did this happen? The ghost stood still, opened its mouth wide, and began to spew black filth and excrement. In a low, harsh voice, it began to tell its mother the gruesome story. The ghost said that Rasmus, despite appearing kind and hard-working in public, was a monster behind closed doors. He would beat Zona and yell at her for the slightest reason. On the night of January 22nd, the day before the Sabine discovered Zona lying on the first flight of stairs, Rasmus was furious about what Zona had prepared for dinner. He grabbed her by the neck and forcefully lifted her off the ground. As the ghost recounted what had happened, it suddenly stopped speaking, a terrifying look in its eyes, as if the horror had transferred from the ghost to Rasmus. The ghost rose into the air, opened its mouth wide, and began to draw air from the room as if sucking it in. Then it turned its head 180 degrees, its chest facing Mary Jane while its head was turned back. The moment Mary Jane's eyes met the ghost's face, she noticed it was smiling at her, as if to say, "You saw what it did to me." And then it vanished. The ghost disappeared, and the room returned to its normal warmth. Mary Jane felt utterly exhausted and collapsed onto the bed, sobbing. The next morning, she rushed to the prosecutor's office to tell him what she had seen. The ghost told her that Rasmus was the one who strangled her daughter and committed that heinous act. Afterward, the public prosecutor went with the doctor who had previously treated Zona for a second examination. The doctor explained that Rasmus had been crying and cradling Zona's head as she died, stroking her hair to conceal the marks on her neck. Later, when the shawl that had been wrapped around her neck during the funeral was removed, it was discovered that her neck was covered with marks resembling fingerprints. Further examination revealed that her neck had been severed by violent strangulation. After her trachea was ruptured, Rasmus was arrested for the murder of his wife. During the trial, Mary Jane testified before the judge, recounting the story of her daughter's ghost, who had told her how to kill Zona. Her testimony was so convincing to the jury that they found Rasmus guilty. Rasmus was sentenced to life imprisonment, but he died only 3 years later from a mysterious illness. It was later revealed that Rasmus had been married twice before his marriage to Zona. He divorced her first wife, and the second died in a strange accident while helping him repair the chimney. A stone fell on her head, killing her instantly. To this day, a plaque near Zona's grave states that this is the only case in which ghostly testimony helped convict a murderer. In early 1999, Christopher Case was living the best days of his life. At 35, he was the CEO of Music Holdings, a music production company specializing in soft, relaxing music. Before that, he had been the music director at a radio station in Richmond, Virginia, where he composed the pieces played between programs and news broadcasts. Christopher was a dedicated and proactive musician who took great care of his health and fitness. He went to the gym daily, took vitamins, and never smoked. He was well liked and close to his family. With his new position, he quickly made new friends, but he also maintained close ties with his old friends in Richmond. Despite his idyllic life and professional success, Christopher preferred solitude to romantic relationships. He refused marriage, content to stay at home listening to classical music, particularly ancient Egyptian music and pieces from ancient Mediterranean civilizations such as Greek and Roman music. For him, this music was more enjoyable than any romantic relationship. On April 11, 1999, Christopher was on a business trip to San Francisco with 2 colleagues. They decided to have dinner outside the restaurant or bar they were at. There, Christopher met a 55-year-old woman, 20 years his senior, but a very beautiful woman whose style and clothing were striking. They struck up a conversation and discovered they shared a love of ancient Egyptian music, the same music Christopher adored. It was a rare coincidence for him, as he had rarely met anyone who shared this kind of music, and he was even more impressed by her. She too seemed to admire him and his musical work. She suggested they meet at his home to listen to his collection of ancient music, while he showed her her own. Christopher felt a little uneasy, as it seemed to him that the woman wanted to start a relationship with him, but he wasn't interested. He admired her only as someone who shared his passion for music, not as a romantic partner. But she wanted something else from him, and as time passed, Her persistence grew increasingly strange. Once captivated by her, he began to fear her because of her relentless demands. Christopher, inexperienced in romantic relationships, politely declined her advances. The woman persisted, her pressure growing, and he continued to refuse politely. Eventually, her behavior changed. She became more aggressive. Instead of being kind and gentle, she began to demand what she wanted in a provocative manner, trying every possible way to get him to agree. But he remained steadfast in his refusal. The fact that a young man was rejecting a beautiful woman like himself infuriated her. Suddenly, she changed completely, her face contorted with rage, as if she were a demon. Then, with a look of pure hatred and fury, she said, "I will make you regret this. I am a witch, and I will cast a curse upon you that will kill you within a week." Christopher heard this and was shocked, not by fear, but by laughter. He wanted to laugh, but held it in. "Whatever you think, Salem," he said with a smile, took a few steps and walked out of the restaurant. Back at his hotel in San Francisco, he picked up the phone and called his best friend, Simi Soder, recounting the funny incident with the strange woman at the restaurant. They both laughed at the curse story, and Simi said, laughing, "You've never been with anyone, and when a woman wants to be with you, you act crazy. Good thing you haven't." They continued laughing on the phone until he said goodbye and hung up. For the next 24 hours, Christopher was back home in Seattle, but on April 13th, his life took a dramatic turn. 48 hours after his encounter with the strange woman, the strange events began to unfold. Christopher was someone who didn't believe in magic, curses, jinn, or ghosts. He considered all of that superstition and nonsense, and he wasn't afraid of it at all. That night, he went to bed, and as he lay down, he began to hear a whisper coming from outside his bedroom, specifically from the kitchen. After a few moments, the sound disappeared, but it returned. He wasn't convinced it was coming from inside his apartment. He thought perhaps the neighbors were talking quietly in the street. But then he started hearing the sound in another part of the apartment, and this time it wasn't coming from the kitchen. He began to worry and fear that there might be a burglar. He quietly got out of bed and walked towards the source of the sound, which was coming from the small laundry room. When he opened the door, the sound disappeared, and he stood looking around anxiously. Suddenly, he caught sight of a dark shadow quickly passing in front of the apartment door. He turned on the light to try and catch it, but he didn't see anyone. The whispering voice persisted, so he turned on all the lights in the apartment to make sure no one was there. Despite this, the voice continued, moving from place to place as if it were haunting him all night. He also glimpsed shadows moving very quickly, but he couldn't pinpoint their source. He stayed up all night, trying to find the source of the whispers and the shadows until morning. Then he called his close friend Simi, and it was clear from his voice that he was very frightened. He told her about the voices that had been haunting him all night, voices whose source he couldn't identify. and about the shadows that moved quickly around his apartment, shadows he couldn't see clearly. All of this was happening even though no one else was in the apartment with him. His close friend listened in shock, unable to believe that Christopher was telling her these things himself. Knowing that he didn't believe in ghosts, spirits, or the supernatural, she urged him, "Call the police and tell them about it." Christopher replied, "What am I supposed to tell them? That I heard strange voices and saw ghosts in my apartment? The police won't believe me." He was right, so he hung up after his friend reassured him, telling him not to worry and hoping it wouldn't happen again. But unfortunately, on the night of April 14th, as he went to bed, it happened again. The mysterious whispering voices and the shadows that moved and disappeared before his eyes. But this time, things took a more terrifying turn. Shadows remained fixed on the wall, like the shadows of a vanished person. As Christopher approached them, they began to fade before his eyes. He stayed awake all night, unable to sleep, telling himself that his mind was simply exhausted and creating these hallucinations. On the third night, April 15th, after 48 hours of sleeplessness, Christopher tried desperately to fall asleep. But in the middle of the night, he opened his eyes, awake but completely paralyzed. He couldn't move his body, only his eyes. In this paralyzed state, he began to hear the whispering again, and he was terrified, unsure of what to do. The previous 2 nights, he had been able to move around the apartment to find the source of the sound, but this time he was in his dark room, completely paralyzed. When he located the source, it was coming from inside his bedroom closets. Then it disappeared, only to reappear from under the bed. He couldn't move and prayed that it was all just a nightmare. Gradually, something appeared from the side of the bed, a black shadow moving above him, and began to strangle him by the neck. He couldn't breathe or move and felt as if his soul was about to leave his body. The shadow lifted him from the bed, but suddenly let him fall again, vanishing before his eyes. He remained paralyzed and lying on the bed, terrified that it might reappear. He remained paralyzed for a while until his body finally regained its mobility. When he got up, he found the mattress around him soaked in blood, and his fingers were all cut and bleeding, as if something sharp had pierced his fingertips. He felt excruciating pain around his neck, and when he looked in the mirror, he saw bruises where the shadow had pressed against him. Fearing for his life, Christopher called his best friend, Simi, and told her everything that had happened that terrifying night. She listened to him but was unable to respond, especially since she was in the old city he had traveled from. His girlfriend couldn't bring himself to say, "Come sleep over," or even book a private plane to come to him. Christopher spoke with difficulty, his tongue heavy, as he described the cuts on his hands, the marks on his neck, and the blood-soaked bed, all while no one else was in his apartment. His girlfriend kept begging him to call the police, but he kept saying, "No way! What am I going to tell them? That I'm being strangled by demons? They'll think I'm crazy, and no one will believe me. The police deal with facts and evidence." Then Christopher remembered the strange woman who had told him, "I'm a witch, and I'm going to put a curse on you." And he began to think that her words, which he had mocked, might actually be true. "I need to protect myself from what's happening," he told his girlfriend on the phone. Christopher thought of a religious bookstore near his home. Perhaps it held something that could protect him from this curse. He went to the bookstore owner, Rodney Higgett, and told him everything before going to the police. Christopher asked the bookseller where the crosses were, and he pointed to the shelves. Christopher chose about 10 crosses, and the bookseller was surprised by the number he was buying. "Why so many?" he asked. Christopher replied hesitantly, "I'm looking for something to protect me from demons and magic. I'm under attack from a supernatural force, and I need protection." The bookseller pointed to shelves containing books that supposedly protected against demonic possession and magic. Christopher bought as many of these books as he could, along with the crosses, and returned to his apartment to begin his defense plan. He hung the crosses all over the apartment, sprinkled salt against every wall and in every corner, lit candles, and began reading the books, copying phrases onto slips of paper, which he then scattered everywhere. Imagine Christopher, the energetic and successful man who exercised daily and had never believed in magic or demons, how his life had been transformed in just 1 week after meeting the woman who had cursed him. He had become depressed, psychologically devastated, fearful, unable to sleep, unable to work, and his entire life had turned into a living hell. On April 16th, Christopher prepared his apartment with salt, crosses, and candles. That night, he went to bed ready to face any demon that might try to kill him. He didn't speak to anyone, but something seemed to frighten him deeply that night, so he left his apartment and checked into a hotel. On the morning of April 17th, his girlfriend, Simi, called to check on him. At that time, there were no cell phones, so she called his landline, unaware that he had checked into the hotel. The landline had an answering machine. If the call didn't answer, a voicemail message could be left. She left a message asking where he was and expressing her concern. His friends, who had learned what had happened to him during the night, were also worried. They contacted each other and decided to call the police. The police arrived at Christopher's apartment and found strands of salt lying in front of the door. They knocked, but no one answered. The door was locked. They told his friends to wait a little while. Perhaps he had gone out and returned. If 48 hours passed without his return, they would search everywhere for him and might even break into the apartment. When Christopher set out of the hotel, he passed by the same bookstore where he had bought the books and crosses. Upon seeing him for the second time, the bookseller was frightened by his appearance. The first time, he had been just an ordinary person seeking protection, but this time, he looked both mentally and physically broken. His body was covered in bruises and marks, and he looked as if he had experienced a near-death experience. He told the bookseller, "Show me your most powerful thing to protect me from magic and demons. Nothing I took from you last time has helped me." The bookseller directed him to a church run by a man named James Callahan and told him, "Go to him. Perhaps he can help and protect you." That same day, his girlfriend, Simi, had been busy at work all day. When she returned, she began checking the voicemail messages on her landline, very worried about him. Finally, she found a message from Christopher. In it, he said he expected to be attacked that night, adding, "They're definitely going to kill me today. I don't know what to do. I'm terrified." His girlfriend listened to the message after returning from work and kept trying to call him, but no one answered. On the morning of April 18th, he didn't go to work, just like the previous days. His colleagues started calling him at home, but he didn't answer. His friends, some of whom didn't know each other, called, and he told them what was happening to him in his apartment. As their concern grew, his family was informed, and the police decided they might have to break into his apartment if he remained missing and the door was locked. The police arrived at Christopher's apartment at 3:30 p.m. on April 18th and knocked on the door as usual, but no one answered. They forced their way into the apartment and were met with a bizarre scene. Crosses hung everywhere, salt strands strewn across the floor like a spider web, melted and burnt wax in every corner, and papers with prayers scattered throughout. They continued searching for him, calling his name in every room, until they entered the bathroom, where they discovered his body lying in the bathtub. There was no water in the tub, and Christopher was clothed, not naked. He had placed candles on the edge of the tub and several crosses around him. He was sitting with his hands on his chest, leaning against the wall, with no visible injuries. The coroner determined that his death was from natural causes, specifically a heart attack. No signs of drug use, hallucinogens, or any other medications or chemicals were found on his body. His friends and family were devastated by the end. Imagine someone known for his activity, his good health, his daily exercise, and his happiness. How his life could have been turned upside down in just 1 week, and how he died so suddenly. Some might wonder, did he bring this upon himself, convincing his subconscious that he would die within a week simply because the woman told him she was a witch? Or were supernatural forces at play, and was what he saw and heard in his apartment real? The terrifying aspect of his story is that he predicted death within a week, and indeed, he died exactly 7 days later. On October 4th, 2017, a 61-year-old man named Tiki Ksai arrived at Stellenbosch Hospital in one of South Africa's wealthiest cities. He had been suffering from stomach problems for the preceding months and had been visiting the hospital regularly for checkups and tests. The doctors determined that he needed surgery, so he was officially admitted, prepared for the operating room, and the procedure was successful. After the operation, he was taken to his room for observation for 2 days, and the medical staff confirmed there were no complications. On October 4th, after the anesthesia wore off, the patient lay in bed, unable to move due to the incision and stitches in his abdomen. He was relaxed, watching television to entertain himself. His family visited him to check on him, and everything seemed normal, without any problems. He remained in bed all day, resting due to the pain and the wound. The following day, at 3:15 a.m., a nurse entered his room to check on him and found him awake and seemingly perfectly fine. After a brief conversation, the nurse excused herself and went to get him more medication. The nurse brought a fresh pillowcase for his bed, replacing the old one, which was undoubtedly stained with blood and antiseptic after the operation. After excusing herself to leave, the patient nodded in thanks and said, "Go ahead." She left the room, leaving him lying on the bed, and went to the hallway where a small trolley, a kind of trolley, was waiting, filled with new sheets, pillowcases, and all the necessary supplies for preparing the patient's room. The nurse took the new sheets and pillowcases and returned to the room to change them. As soon as she opened the door, she didn't find the patient in his bed. The room had a small bathroom and a door, and when the nurse went in to check on him, she didn't find him inside the bathroom, so she assumed he was inside. She quickly changed the sheets and pillowcase and brought a fresh blanket and everything else that needed changing before he came out of the bathroom. After she finished arranging the room, she looked towards the bathroom door, expecting him to come out at any moment. But after 2 minutes, he still hadn't appeared. Anxiety began to creep into her mind. She heard no sound from inside the bathroom, so she opened the door to check on it. It was open as usual, and the bathroom was empty. There was no sign of him. The nurse was stunned. The patient had vanished completely. She searched the room, the bathroom, and every corner of the place, but found no trace of him. Even assuming he had left the room, it was impossible. He had just undergone abdominal surgery, and the wound was closed with stitches, so he couldn't move quickly. Any movement would have been very slow. Yet there was no sign of him. The hospital administration, despite their surprise, preferred to search quietly so as not to alarm the other patients and their families. They didn't contact the police initially, preferring to try to find him internally first. After searching all day, from the roof to the garage, from the bathrooms to the storage rooms and other rooms, they found no trace of the patient. Finally, the hospital administration was forced to inform the patient's family. They asked them to contact the family discreetly and told them the patient may have left the hospital and not returned home. We searched for him but couldn't find him. The family was shocked by this response, especially since they were certain he was still in the hospital. Even more shocking, the hospital hadn't filed an official report with the police about the patient's disappearance. The family went to the hospital with the police, who began searching the entire premises. They reviewed the security camera footage but found nothing, so they expanded their search to the areas surrounding the hospital. They found no trace of him in the area surrounding the hospital, and this continued for several days with no hope of finding the man. Then came October 20th, almost 2 weeks after the patient's disappearance. On that day, maintenance workers were carrying out renovations inside the hospital. One of them climbed a ladder to repair something in the ceiling. The ceiling he was working on had an opening, a very large space covering most of the floor. When the worker climbed up, armed with a flashlight, he noticed something strange in a far corner of the attic. Using the light, he saw a figure sitting on the floor in that corner. It turned out that this figure was the body of patient TK, who had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. The hospital had no idea how the man had gotten there, as the area was only accessible to maintenance workers. The terrifying question was, How could someone who had just undergone surgery and had serious abdominal injuries have climbed to that spot on his own without any assistance and then positioned himself in the corner of the attic? Even if he had discovered the entrance, it was impossible for him to have moved with such speed and strength. Upon examining the body, it was determined that the death was from natural causes, with no evidence of complications from the surgery or any criminal activity. However, the patient's family told the media that they considered this impossible and that the hospital might have played a role in concealing the body in the attic. What power in the world could transport the body of a patient in such a condition to the attic in this manner? No evidence was found to prove the hospital's involvement, and the hospital administration issued a statement saying they were surprised by the incident and that they had fully cooperated with the police and the family to find him, emphasizing that they had not interfered in his post-operative care. The case remained unsolved, and the patient's family was shocked by the investigation's findings. How could a patient disappear from the hospital and be found dead in the attic 2 weeks later without anyone taking responsibility or presenting any evidence? As the days and months passed, people began to forget the matter, considering it an isolated incident unlikely to be repeated. But in 2019, another strange incident occurred in a different hospital. On May 10, about a year and a half after the TK incident, a 53-year-old man named Sandy L. Sabiha, a father of 4, arrived at the Mahatma Gandhi Hospital in Durban, one of South Africa's wealthiest and most beautiful cities, similar to Stellenbosch. Sandy, a construction worker, had fallen from scaffolding, fracturing his large femur between his hip and knee. Naturally, an accident of this severity would have prevented him from walking, so his colleagues carried him to the hospital. 2 days later, on May 12, his cousin came to visit him and found him seemingly normal and talking to him as usual. After the visit, the cousin left, knowing that Sandy would later be transferred to another hospital for X-rays and specialized surgery to monitor his condition. However, when the medical team entered his room to move him from his bed to the ambulance that would take him to the other hospital, they found him completely gone. This hospital in Durban was one of the most heavily guarded. But unlike Stellenbosch Hospital, where the first patient disappeared, this hospital's response was completely different. They immediately contacted the authorities and police, reporting the patient's disappearance without hesitation or fear of scandal, unlike the previous hospital. On May 18th, about a week after the search for the missing patient began, the entire hospital started to smell a very foul odor. Security personnel followed the smell, trying to find its source, until they discovered it was coming from a small storage room used for storing old records and books. When they opened the door to the storage room, they saw a black liquid dripping from the ceiling onto the wall. They then discovered that Sandy L's body was hanging from the suspended ceiling of the room. Strangely, the autopsy results were never released, and no one spoke about it at all. The patient's family refused to comment to the media. All we know today is that 2 men from South Africa, within just 2 years of each other, were found dead in a hospital ceiling after mysteriously disappearing. Both men were in poor health. had recently undergone surgery and were unable to move or walk long distances. 3 theories have emerged to explain what happened in the 2 incidents. The first theory: the men climbed to the ceiling themselves and were left there to die of hunger and thirst. This theory is completely impossible, as their physical condition wouldn't have allowed them to easily get out of bed. The second theory: they were murdered and their bodies were placed in the ceiling. However, the problem here is that autopsies revealed no signs of foul play or violence on the bodies. The third and most bizarre theory: the men experienced a phenomenon called teleportation, a hypothetical ability to move from one place to another in the blink of an eye, without traversing the distance between them. It's an unproven phenomenon, but it's recounted in many stories, like the one about the train that disappeared in a tunnel and reappeared in another country. The truth remains unknown, and the final interpretation is up to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. In the town of Salina, Texas, Olivia Mabel lived a peaceful life with her husband, Travis, and their only son, Aiden, who was 6 years old. The family lived harmoniously, and no one among the neighbors had ever heard of any problems or arguments between them. Everyone loved them. Then came the fateful day that turned their lives upside down. The day Aiden drowned in a pond. No one noticed his fall until they found his body floating on the surface of the water. When the body was taken to the hospital, the medical examiner confirmed that the boy had fallen into the water alone because he couldn't swim, and he drowned. The tragedy was more than they could bear. The parents had lost their only son, their hope in life, the light of their home. Imagine waiting to see your son grow up before your eyes, graduate, work, get married, and have grandchildren, and then have it all vanish in an instant. This was the reality for Olivia and Travis. After Aiden's death, the parents suffered a nervous breakdown, especially Olivia, who sank into a deep depression. She stopped leaving the house, stopped going to work, stopped speaking to her friends, and even stopped talking to her husband. She completely stopped receiving visitors. Her husband tried repeatedly to help her out of this state and was very patient with her. But the days turned into months, and the months into a whole year, and Olivia didn't change. She was like a body without a soul. She didn't speak, she didn't go out, she didn't work, and she did nothing but wallow in her grief. As time passed, her husband couldn't bear it any longer, and the problems between them escalated. He accused her of being the reason for the child's death and of being a negligent mother. She, in turn, would have fits of rage and screaming, to the point that neighbors, who had never heard a peep from them before, began to hear the arguments, shouting, and breaking things daily. Until the couple finally decided to separate. After the divorce, her husband married another woman and started a new life. As for Olivia, she remained as she was, alone, broken, living in the darkness of her grief over her only child. Olivia remained in that state for a long time, until she finally decided to isolate herself from the house. Every inch of it reminded her of her son and the beautiful memories she shared with him. What pained her most was her son's room, where his toys and clothes were still kept. She could no longer bear to stay in the house, so she withdrew and isolated herself from everything around her. The house remained closed and deserted for several months, with no one entering. In September 1991, neighbors noticed Olivia's reappearance after a long absence. She was wandering aimlessly around her old house, seemingly out of her mind. The neighbors said, "This woman has officially lost her mind. Life has battered her." They became afraid to approach or speak to her. A short time later, Olivia disappeared again. It is believed she was committed to a mental institution or hospital, and she remained missing for years, her whereabouts unknown. Then came February 24th, 1994, when the police station received a call from an unknown number. The police tried to answer the call several times, but no one responded. They tried to speak to the caller, saying, "If you're in trouble and scared, please keep the line open as much as possible so we can locate you and send help." After a few minutes, the call was disconnected, but those minutes were enough for the police to trace the call's origin. Tracing showed that the call came from the abandoned home of Olivia Mabel and her ex-husband, Travis, which had been deserted for years. Despite this, the police sent a team to check the house for any suspicious activity. The police vehicles approached the house quietly, without sirens or lights on, so as not to give anyone a chance to escape. The officers began circling the house on foot, checking the windows and doors for any signs of forced entry. All the windows were intact and locked. When they forced open the front door and entered, they found it completely covered in dirt. Dust covered every inch of the floor, from the floor to the ceiling, including the furniture and chairs, confirming that no one had entered the house for years. The police were puzzled as to how a call could have come from a landline in a completely abandoned house, but they noticed that the tracking devices confirmed the call's origin. So they decided to search the entire house. Every room was covered in dust, including the doors and floors, with no trace of any unfamiliar footsteps. The only visible marks were the police officers' own boots. Upon reaching the last room, they expected it to be like the others, empty and dusty. But when they opened the door, they were shocked. The room was spotless, strangely tidy, without a trace of dust, and everything was neatly arranged. The biggest shock was finding Olivia Mabel's body in the middle of the room, sitting on a wooden chair, wearing a nightgown, with a handmade wooden doll in her arms. The doll was covered with pieces of her son Aiden's clothing. In front of her was a table with children's toys, pictures and drawings of the child, and even his shoes. Candles and roses were also found, as well as a container containing soil or ashes, which later turned out to be what remained of her son Aiden's body after it was cremated. Amidst all this, they found a handwritten note by Olivia. It read, "Eden, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have let things get this far. I'm leaving, and I won't let that evil creature keep me locked up any longer. Your mom is coming for you, Sweet Eden. Your mom loves you." Beside the note were scattered yellowed papers, each with a single word written on it, such as create or build. The neighbors were right when they said Olivia had lost her mind. But what was even stranger was that the note was dated February 24th, 1994, the same day the police broke into her home. However, the coroner determined that Olivia had been dead for a month. This raised a perplexing question. If she had been dead for a month, who wrote the note? And who had called the police from the landline inside the house? The police officers who stormed the house said they felt uneasy as soon as they entered, as if an unseen entity was watching them. Investigators said Olivia was practicing some kind of magic, but they didn't know what it was. One police officer, Francisco Santiago, who had an interest in the paranormal, consulted his uncle to find out what Olivia was doing. Upon reviewing the case photos, the uncle confirmed that the strange words, incantations, candles, roses, and ashes were evidence that Olivia was performing pagan rituals aimed at summoning an entity called a student, not an ordinary student. According to ancient Buddhist beliefs, the purpose of these rituals was to create an imaginary entity in the mind, giving it a form and name. This entity then begins to break free and become independent from the person who created it, like a fetus growing in its mother's womb until it is born as an independent being. The students represented the spirit of her son, Aiden, an attempt by Olivia to embody a version of him so she wouldn't feel his loss. But many questions remain. Why was the letter handwritten and dated the same day as the police raid, even though she had died a month earlier? Who called the police from the landline phone inside the house? What entity or creature did she unleash, and did it get out of her control? Her body showed no signs of violence or suicide. Her death appeared to be from natural causes. The house remained locked for a decade, and no one dared to live there because of rumors of it being haunted and the widespread story about it in the United States. In 2005, the homeowner decided to consult a paranormal expert named Austin Drew Navarre. Upon entering, he said, "I've been inside many haunted houses, but this one has an unparalleled evil energy. I can't breathe anymore, and my heart races. The only solution for this house is to leave it locked and avoid entering it." The mystery of Olivia and the entity she tried to summon remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the history of realistic horror to this day. Kevin Manns, an antiques dealer, was always on the lookout for unusual and rare items. One day, he learned of a house for sale that had belonged to a Jewish woman, a Holocaust survivor, who had passed away at the age of 103. Her descendants were auctioning off the entire contents of the house, including furniture, antiques, and vintage items, chandeliers, lamps, mirrors, rugs, candlesticks, statues, everything. At the auction, the contents of the house were categorized into sets, each set being offered for sale complete. The bedroom with its furniture, the entire chandelier set, the kitchenware, and so on. It was the turn of set number 29, which contained some delicate items and an old wooden box. For Kevin, the box was a mystery. Kevin was dying to know what was inside, so he kept bidding until he won the set. As he carried the box, he overheard one of the attendees say to his colleague, "Wow, look, the guy bought the teddy bear box." The word Dobke stirred childhood memories for Kevin. His parents had always warned him about the Dobke, a malevolent, subterranean creature in Jewish culture. Broken, vengeful spirits, disembodied, that seek to possess humans, bringing them destruction and ruin. Intrigued and terrified, Kevin asked the homeowner's granddaughter, "I heard someone mention the Dobke box. What's in it?" She replied cautiously, "We don't know what's in it. Our grandmother was the only one who knew, and she always warned us not to go near the box. If we asked her, she'd say, 'Don't ask, it's none of your business.'" Kevin sensed a great secret was being kept hidden, but he thanked her and left, carrying all the auction items, including the mysterious box, back to his shop. Kevin's shop had 2 floors, the ground floor for displaying items to customers, and the basement as a storage area, where he inspected and checked new pieces before they were put on display. He placed the box on a table in the storage room, but his curiosity proved too strong. He went back and fetched a chair and sat in front of the box. It was about 35 centimeters wide and 50 centimeters high, with 2 front doors and a small bottom drawer, secured by a lock for which he didn't have the key. Not wanting to damage the box, he used a thin screwdriver to pry open the metal screws until he could open the 2 doors. As soon as he opened the box, the bottom drawer automatically extended with a precise mechanical movement, as if the box had been designed that way a century ago. Kevin was amazed that the old mechanical mechanism still worked so smoothly after all these years. Anyway, when Kevin opened the box, he found 2 locks of hair wrapped in a piece of cloth, one white or blonde, the other black. There was also a strangely shaped black candlestick, a small metal cup, and in the center of the box was a stone inscribed with the Hebrew word Shalom. In the bottom drawer were dried roses. Kevin looked at the contents of the box and laughed sarcastically, thinking that the deceased owner had collected these things as cherished mementos, and that the story of the Dobke she had invented to scare her grandchildren was just a trick, just as his parents had used it to scare him when he was little. He closed the box, put it aside, and went upstairs to the showroom. Kevin had an employee named Jane who was in charge of sales and accounts and managed the store in his absence. The next morning, Jane went to open the store, locked the main door behind her, and then opened the door to the lower storeroom, which had no other access except through this door and a wooden ladder. She lit the storeroom with just 4 neon lights, then began inspecting, cleaning, and preparing the merchandise for display upstairs. But while Jane was downstairs in the storeroom, she suddenly felt she wasn't alone. She felt something watching her, a strange sensation she'd never experienced before. The storeroom was completely sealed off, with no windows or other entrances, yet she felt an unseen presence with her. Suddenly, the landline phone on the table in the storeroom rang. Startled, Jane picked up the receiver to hear her friend say she was bringing some antiques to the shop. As she spoke, she heard the sound of a wooden stick falling to the floor, like a cane leaning against a wall and then toppling. She tried to ignore the sound, but her terror grew. She started to move toward the source of the sound among the shelves, but suddenly she heard the sound of glass breaking, and a neon light fell from the ceiling and shattered on the floor. Her terror intensified, and she completely forgot the first sound. As she tried to escape down the stairs, a heavy wooden chair fell from the shelves in front of her, nearly crushing her. That's when she realized she was completely trapped. The storeroom door was locked from the outside, and she had no way of opening it from the inside. She was stuck with something unknown, something that seemed to be smashing the merchandise and turning the storeroom upside down. Jane tried to break down the door or scream, but she was paralyzed and terrified. The scene suggested the presence of a terrifying entity inside the storeroom, unknown and unseen, yet controlling everything around it. Jane was forced to confront this mystery amidst the silence of the storeroom, the eerie shadow of the Dobke box standing motionless in the corner. Jane was downstairs in the storeroom, unaware that Kevin was upstairs, having locked the door from the outside. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, peering into the dark storeroom, the sound of neon lights shattering one after another, intensifying her terror. Each falling bulb deepened the darkness and the fear of something unknown that could appear at any moment and attack her. Minutes later, Kevin's phone rang in his car. It was Jane, frantically calling, screaming, "Help! I'm locked in the storeroom and some crazy person is smashing things. They might kill me any second." Kevin could hear banging and crashing behind her. He answered quickly, "What's going on? Are you okay?" Jane cried, "Help! Call the police right now!" The line went dead. Kevin ran to the store and found the main door locked. He quickly unlocked the door and entered the showroom, expecting to find an armed gang. But to his surprise, everything was in its place. No theft, no damage, no signs of forced entry. He ran to the locked storeroom door, wondering how it could be locked from the outside when he was the only one with the key. Wasting no time, he retrieved the key, carefully unlocked the storeroom, and stepped inside, switching on his phone's flashlight. He saw Jane sitting in the office chair, stunned like a statue, silent and motionless. The floor was littered with broken glass and overturned antiques, and a foul odor, like cat urine, permeated the air. "What happened here?" Kevin asked her. Jane began to recount everything that had happened since she went down to the storeroom. The strange noises, the objects moving on their own, and the constant breaking of merchandise. Kevin tried to find any trace of the unknown person who had caused this mess, but he found no one except Jane, who was bewildered and unable to explain what had occurred. Kevin initially suspected that Jane might be responsible for everything, so he asked her sharply, "Did you do this?" Jane trembled and said, "I can't. I didn't do anything, and I'm never going back there." 2 days after the warehouse incident, it was Kevin's mother's birthday. Kevin arrived at the store, which was decorated for the celebration, and prepared her gift, a teddy bear box. When his mother opened the box, she was overcome with fear. Her legs merely gave way, and she collapsed into the chair in front of the table. She tried to move her lips to warn Kevin about the box, about the danger it contained, but she couldn't speak or move, only move her eyes. She would look from the box at her son, then back at the box, silently trying to convey an urgent message. The box was the cause of what happened, and it had to be disposed of. Kevin saw his mother in this state and immediately ran to call emergency services. His mother was unable to move or speak. She could only stare at the box, her eyes saying more than words could express. Kevin noticed his mother trying to warn him about the box, gesturing towards it with her eyes. But at that moment, he was preoccupied with her health and not thinking about the box. An ambulance took her to the hospital, where she was admitted to the intensive care unit and placed in intensive care. Kevin sat at home, pondering the events and connecting the dots. His employee, Jane, had experienced terrifying mishaps in the warehouse because of the teddy bear box, and his mother had suffered a stroke in front of it, trying to warn him about it. Kevin decided the box was cursed, haunted, or simply unlucky, and he had to get rid of it. He took the box up to the store's display, hoping a customer would buy it. 2 days later, 2 customers came in, Jane and her son. They liked the box and bought it, and Kevin felt relieved to finally be rid of the cursed box, or at least what seemed to be a cursed or unlucky one. But one night, while he was in the store, he heard the shop door open and close by itself. He went to investigate and was shocked. He found the teddy bear box lying on the floor of the showroom with a note on it that read, "The thing inside this box is cruel and strange." Kevin was stunned and realized that the box hadn't actually been taken away from him, and that what it contained was something unnatural. He finally decided to take it home to find a way to get rid of it. He put the box in his bedroom closet and went to sleep. In his sleep, he had a strange dream. A beautiful woman whose hand he held, and he felt a sense of trust toward her as if he had known her for a long time. But the dream took a dark turn. The woman began to move away from him and disappeared into the darkness. He tried to reach her but couldn't, and he stood waiting for her. Suddenly, an old woman appeared in the darkness. She began to approach him, lifted him about a meter away, and then quickly raised her face. Her face was decaying, and her flesh was rotting like a corpse. She began to dig her claws into him. Kevin woke up with a start and ran to the bathroom to wash his face. He noticed marks and bruises on his shoulder and arm that hadn't been there before. He tried to ignore them at first, but the next night he had the same nightmare again, this time finding cuts and scratches on his back and neck. That's when he started connecting the dots and realized that everything happening to him was caused by the teddy bear box. He decided to get rid of the box. He opened his computer and posted an ad on eBay, selling it for any price, explaining, "The box is easy to break, but I don't know what's inside, and I'm afraid to destroy it. If you're into strange objects, come and buy the box." Two young men from Missouri, Sam and Brian, responded quickly. They were both fascinated by all things genies, ghosts, and paranormal phenomena. They read the description and bought the box immediately, and Kevin shipped it to them. 3 weeks later, the package arrived at Sam's house, and he received it cautiously. Because of the teddy bear box, some people died. Others were hospitalized, and still others suffered strange illnesses. The previous shop owner who bought the box and the students who acquired it all experienced terrifying events. When Jason told his colleagues at the museum about the box, they laughed and said, "Wow, that's a really cool piece. Congratulations." Suddenly, all the computers on their desks shut down at once, and at the same moment, all the lights in the museum went out. The colleagues felt a sharp pain in their stomachs and began to back away quickly. They told Jason to remove the box from the museum immediately, insisting, "We were fine until you brought in that cursed thing. Suddenly our machines stopped working and we were in a bad way. Don't bring that box into the museum again." Jason heard their words, took the box, and put it in his car. When he got home, he didn't want to take it inside. He clearly felt the curse of the box, so he decided to leave it in the car and go to sleep, hoping to find a way to get rid of it in the morning. But in the middle of the night, Jason awoke, unable to move a single part of his body, as if paralyzed. He could only move his eyes, and soon he heard heavy footsteps climbing the stairs. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the crack he saw a black figure advancing up the stairs. Suddenly, the door opened slowly, and the black thing appeared. An old woman wearing a shawl on her head, staring at the floor. She entered the room and slithered down the floor, approaching the bed where Jason lay, until she was underneath him and disappeared for a few seconds. Then she rose to her knees and extended her claws to dig into Jason's eyes, trying to gouge them out. Jason screamed in terror and pain and was suddenly awakened by his wife's voice, realizing it had all been a nightmare. But he noticed red marks around his eyes, and the whites of his eyes had turned bloodshot. The sight was so terrifying that even his wife was shocked. Then Jason remembered that the box's previous owners had mentioned in an eBay ad that they were experiencing holographic dreams and waking up terrified with bruises all over their bodies. Jason realized that everything happening to him was because of the teddy bear box. The next day, while watching TV with his young son, the boy suddenly asked, "Dad, who's that woman standing behind the sofa?" Jason looked and saw the same terrifying woman from his nightmare before she vanished just as suddenly. He told his son he'd seen it, then called his wife, saying, "Get ready, we have to leave right now." He took his wife and son to the car and told them all about the cursed box, explaining that it was in the trunk and that he was looking for a way to get rid of it without causing any harm. Jason thought for a moment and realized that a quiet house away from the city was the perfect place to put the box temporarily. He moved it to the basement and drove his family back to their city home. After much deliberation, he decided to contact the box's original owner, Kevin, the only person who knew the secret of the box and its effectiveness. When Jason called, he asked Kevin for any information that might help him get rid of the box, but Kevin reluctantly replied, "I'll try to help you. I saw what happened to you because of the box. It was hard for me too." Then Kevin began to think about the granddaughter of the Jewish woman who had sold him the box, trying to find any clue or explanation for what the box contained and what it did. Jason finally decided to call his granddaughter, Sophie, to find out the secret of the box. He told her, "I'm the dealer who bought lot number 29, the one with the wooden box, the Dobke box. I need any information I can get because a lot of people have been affected by it, including me, and we don't know how to get rid of it." Sophie listened and said, "I told my family not to put the box up for auction, but they insisted and decided to sell it. I warned you back then. I told you that box shouldn't be opened, and Grandma warned us against opening it." Jason recounted all the misfortunes that had occurred since the box was opened. The employee had horrific accidents in the warehouse. His mother had a stroke. The students who bought the box suffered disasters, and the person who bought it from them as well. He added, "The person who has the box now wants to get rid of it, but he doesn't know how." Sophie sighed and began to tell him the secret of the box. "My grandmother lived with her cousin in Poland during World War II. Their names were Havia and her cousin, and they spent their time performing seances for entertainment. My grandmother made a Ouija board, and she and her cousin would hold the chain. At the end of the chain was something like a pendant. They would move the chain on the Ouija board to try and summon the spirit to answer their questions." Sophie continued, "My grandmother tried many times, but the experiments failed. Then one time, the chain became stiff and taut, and it moved on its own, spelling out words on the Ouija board. 'Release me, let me go.' At that moment, my grandmother and her cousin panicked and were afraid it was the evil spirit of the Dobke. So they performed a ritual to release the spirit of the object, then locked it in the wooden box and sealed it shut." Kevin, having heard every detail, said to her, "Okay, everything you said is clear, but we opened the box and it harmed us. What's the solution now to get rid of it and avoid being harmed by its curse?" Sophie replied, "There's only one option, the rabbi. He's the only one who knows how to deal with this box." And indeed, Kevin contacted Jason and they brought the rabbi. The rabbi took the box and performed a precise burial ritual, sealing it so that the evil spirit inside couldn't escape. And that's the end of the story of the box of Dobke. And by the way, Sophie confirmed that this story is completely true. I'm so tired. Subscribe and like. If you have a story that happened to you or something scary happened to you, don't hesitate to write the story on Instagram. I'll feature this story on the channel and mention you in the video. That's all. Bye!